Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this peaceful corner of history, where ancient wisdom meets modern life. Before we dive into today's incredible journey, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to drop a comment and let me know. If you enjoy discovering how our ancestors solved the same problems we face today, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our fascinating adventures through time. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of monk mode? It's become this massive productivity trend in 2024, where people disconnect from distractions, wake up at ungodly hours, and follow rigid schedules to maximize their focus and output. Influencers are making millions teaching this concept, claiming they've discovered some revolutionary approach to time management and discipline. But here's the thing that's absolutely mind-blowing. What they're calling revolutionary, what they're packaging as some cutting-edge life hack? Medieval monks were already masters of this exact system over 1,000 years ago. And I'm not talking about some watered-down version of productivity culture. I'm talking about a time management system so sophisticated, so brutal, and so effective that it would make modern productivity gurus weep with envy. So settle in, let that tension melt from your shoulders, and prepare to discover how these sleep-deprived saints cracked the code on sustainable high performance that our modern world is desperately trying to recreate. Picture this scene, and I want you to really immerse yourself in this moment. It's 4:30 in the morning on a cold December day in medieval Europe. The year is 1147, and you're standing in the stone corridors of a Cistercian monastery. The air is thick with the lingering smoke of beeswax candles and the sharp bite of incense that's been burning since midnight. Your breath creates small clouds in the frigid air as distant chanting echoes through the vaulted ceilings above. This isn't some peaceful, serene meditation retreat. This is the world of the sleep-deprived saints who mastered time itself. Imagine if your smartphone had a monk mode, but instead of just blocking notifications, it transported you into a world where every breath was visible, every footstep echoed with purpose, and every moment was calibrated for peak human performance. That's exactly where we're standing right now. The monks around you have already been awake for hours. While you were probably dreaming in your warm bed, these men had already completed their first prayer service of the day, called nocturnes, which began at midnight and lasted until 3 a.m. 3 hours of continuous prayer, chanting, and spiritual discipline while the rest of the world slept. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. After those 3 hours of spiritual work, they didn't go back to bed for a full night's sleep like any reasonable person would do. No, they practiced what sleep researchers today call segmented sleep, or first and second sleep. They would sleep for about 3 to 4 hours, then wake up at midnight for nocturnes, stay awake for 3 hours, then go back to sleep for another 3 to 4 hour segment. This wasn't some accident of medieval ignorance. This was a carefully designed system that split their sleep into 2 distinct phases, maximizing both their spiritual practice and their cognitive performance. Imagine trying to explain this to a modern sleep specialist. Oh, I wake up at midnight every night, pray, and chant for 3 hours, then go back to sleep until 4:30 a.m. They'd probably recommend immediate therapy. But these monks weren't just surviving on this schedule, they were thriving on it. They were running some of the most successful agricultural operations in medieval Europe, copying and preserving the world's knowledge and maintaining complex theological debates that would influence Christianity for centuries. The sensory experience of their world was unlike anything we can imagine today. Picture yourself in that monastery at 4:30 a.m. The stone floors are ice-cold beneath your sandaled feet. The air carries the scent of burning firewood from the few heated spaces in the complex, mixed with the earthier smells of wool habits that haven't been washed in weeks, and the metallic tang of incense bowls that have been burning continuously for hours. But what's incredible is that this wasn't just random scheduling. These monks had developed what was essentially the world's first sophisticated time management system, complete with seasonal adjustments that wouldn't look out of place in a modern corporate efficiency manual. Think of it this way. While we struggle with seasonal depression and winter blues, these medieval masters had already cracked the code on seasonal optimization adjusting their entire operational framework based on natural rhythms that modern science is only now beginning to understand. During summer months, when sunrise came early, they would wake at 4:30 a.m. for their morning prayers. But during the brutal winter months, when dawn didn't break until much later, they adjusted their entire schedule backward, sometimes not beginning their day until 7:30 a.m. This wasn't laziness. This was strategic seasonal optimization that took into account natural light cycles, agricultural demands, and human circadian rhythms centuries before science had names for these concepts. The genius of their system becomes clear when you realize they weren't just managing time. They were managing energy, attention, and human limitation within a framework that demanded peak performance across multiple domains simultaneously. Through 8 prayer services per day, they were also running agricultural operations that fed entire regions, managing complex financial systems that would make modern banks envious, and preserving and copying the intellectual treasures of the ancient world. Here's the mind-blowing part. Imagine trying to run Apple, Harvard University, and a Fortune 500 agricultural company simultaneously, while also maintaining a meditation practice that requires you to wake up every few hours for spiritual exercises. That's essentially what these monks were pulling off, centuries before anyone had invented the concept of work-life balance. Let me paint you an even more vivid picture of what this looked like in practice. It's now 5 a.m. and the bell for Lords is about to ring. You're in the chapel, and the air is thick with incense smoke that creates ghostly patterns in the candlelight. The stone walls seem to absorb and amplify every whisper, every footstep, every creak of wooden prayer stalls. Around you, dozens of men file silently into their assigned positions, their brown wool habits rustling softly in the pre-dawn darkness. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite having been awake since midnight, despite operating on fragmented sleep that would destroy most modern people, these monks display a level of focused attention and mental clarity that seems almost superhuman. Their chanting is precise, their movements are deliberate, and their concentration appears unshakable. They've somehow cracked the code on sustainable high performance that modern productivity culture is still desperately trying to understand. As Lords concludes, and the first hints of dawn begin to filter through the tall, narrow windows, the monks transition immediately into their work periods. And this is where their time management system reveals its true sophistication. Different. Groups disperse to different activities with military precision. Some head to the scriptorium to begin copying manuscripts, their minds already sharp and ready for the detailed intellectual work ahead. Others move toward the agricultural areas to begin the day's farming tasks. What's incredible is that this wasn't chaos. Every monk knew exactly where he needed to be, what work he needed to accomplish, and how his individual productivity fit into the larger mission of the community. They had created what modern business theorists call aligned autonomy, a system where individual initiative served collective goals without micromanagement or constant supervision. The winter months brought their own unique challenges and adaptations. Picture this. It's January in northern France, and the monastery is locked in winter's grip. Snow covers the fields, and the only heated space in the entire complex is the calefactory, a single room with a large fireplace where monks could warm themselves for brief periods during the day. In these conditions, their sophisticated time management became a matter of survival. Imagine working from home, but your home is a medieval castle with no central heating, no electricity, and your only warm space is the size of a modern living room that you have to share with 100 co-workers. Yet these monks didn't just survive winter, they turned it into their most productive season. During these harsh months, the monks would gather in the calefactory after the early morning prayers, their breath visible in the frigid air as they planned the day's activities. Their brown cucula, thick wool cowls designed for winter wear, would be heavy with moisture from their frozen breath. But even in these conditions, their scheduling system adapted seamlessly. Indoor work took precedence, manuscript copying increased, and communal activities were concentrated during the warmest parts of the day. The crackling of the calefactory fire becomes the soundtrack for some of their most productive periods. In this one heated room, monks would engage in rapid knowledge transfer, sharing techniques for manuscript illumination, discussing theological questions, and coordinating the complex logistics of maintaining their community through winter. The contrast between the bitter cold of the unheated areas and the warm, productive atmosphere of the calefactory created natural rhythms of focus and restoration that modern office design is still trying to replicate. But perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of their system was how they handled what we would now call work-life balance, except they didn't see work and spiritual life as separate things that needed to be balanced. They had integrated them so completely that manual labor became a form of prayer, intellectual work became spiritual discipline, and community management became an expression of divine service. While we're constantly trying to juggle competing priorities, checking work emails during family dinner, feeling guilty about personal time during work hours, these monks had discovered something revolutionary. What if work and meaning weren't opposites fighting for your attention, but partners dancing in perfect harmony? This integration created something remarkable, a sustainable high-performance culture that lasted not just for months or years, but for centuries. Individual monks might burn out or struggle, but the system itself was anti-fragile. It actually became stronger under stress, more refined under pressure, and more effective as it encountered challenges. Imagine modern productivity experts trying to study this system. They'd probably focus on the schedule, the early rising, the disciplined routines, but they'd miss the crucial element that made it all work, the deeper sense of purpose that transformed every mundane task into something meaningful. When copying a manuscript wasn't just a job, but a sacred act of preserving knowledge for future generations, when tending crops wasn't just farming, but participating in divine creation, when managing community resources wasn't just administration, but practicing stewardship of God's gifts, every activity became charged with significance that sustained motivation through the most difficult periods. As morning progresses and you move through this medieval world, you begin to notice details that reveal just how sophisticated their approach really was. The careful attention to seasonal rhythms that allows maximum productivity while respecting natural limitations. The integration of physical, intellectual, and spiritual activities that prevents the kind of burnout that plagues modern high achievers. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind: the way different types of work are sequenced to optimize both individual energy and community resources. The monks understood something that modern productivity culture often misses: sustainable. High performance requires not just discipline and systems, but also meaning, community, and respect for human limitations. Their brutal schedules were balanced by deep social connection. Their intense work periods were punctuated by regular spiritual restoration, and their individual achievement was always in service of something larger than themselves. By mid-morning, as the winter sun finally climbs high enough to provide meaningful light through the monastery's windows, you start to see the true genius of their system. This isn't just about waking up early or following rigid schedules. This is about creating a total life system that optimizes human potential across multiple dimensions simultaneously. This isn't just about waking up early or following rigid schedules. This is sentence 11. But we can't. But here's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. These sleep-deprived saints who mastered time weren't just running spiritual communities. They were operating what were essentially medieval startups, and their business acumen would make modern entrepreneurs jealous. As the morning light grows stronger, revealing the true scope of their operations, you begin to realize that you're not just looking at a monastery. You're looking at a sophisticated medieval Amazon, complete with supply chains, logistics networks, financial instruments, and market strategies that were centuries ahead of their time. Picture Jeff Bezos trying to explain Amazon's business model to investors. We'll have warehouses everywhere, optimize delivery routes, create our own payment systems, and build customer loyalty that lasts for generations. Now imagine a medieval abbot saying essentially the same thing in 1147, except his business model actually lasted for centuries, not decades. As the sun rises higher, revealing the true scope of these medieval empires, what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about medieval life. The echo of footsteps in those monastery corridors wasn't accidental. These buildings were designed to amplify whispers, to carry secrets and urgent business communications across stone halls with the precision of a medieval internet. And that's exactly what they were. The world's first integrated business empires, operating with a sophistication that would make modern CEOs weep with envy. I'm standing here looking at the archaeological remains of Reading Abbey, where 2024 excavations have revealed something absolutely mind-blowing. These weren't just places of prayer. They were medieval Amazons, complete distribution centers that would make Jeff Bezos himself take notes. The archaeologists found something that gave me chills. Logistics tablets that tracked inventory, shipping routes and delivery schedules with a precision that rivals modern supply chain management. Except these were carved in stone and designed to last for centuries, not stored in cloud servers that could crash tomorrow. Picture this, Brother Thomas waking up at 4 a.m., not just for morning prayers, but to check the brewery operations. The grain shipments from their estates in 3 different counties, the hospital wing where they're treating everyone from nobility to peasants, the scriptorium where monks are hand-copying manuscripts that will sell across Europe, the guest house that's booked solid with traveling merchants, and the agricultural operations that feed not just the monastery, but entire surrounding communities. This is what the 2024 Reading Abbey excavations revealed, a complex of timber buildings, sophisticated water management systems, and industrial-scale operations that operated 24/7 for over 400 years. The archaeologists found evidence of watermills that could process grain for thousands of people, workshops that manufactured everything from shoes to silverware, and a hospitality infrastructure that puts modern hotels to shame. But here's the kicker. They were doing all of this centuries before anyone had invented the word corporation. These monasteries were running integrated supply chains when most of Europe was still figuring out basic agriculture. They had quality, control brand management, international trade networks, and even what we'd recognize today as research and development departments. Let me take you inside St. Gall Monastery in Switzerland during its golden age. You walk through the main gate, and you're hit with the sound of hammering from the metalworks, the grinding of grain from the mills, the voices of students in the school and the chanting from the chapel, all happening simultaneously. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery mingles with the herbs from the medicinal garden and the smoke from the forge. It's like walking into the world's first co-working space, except instead of hipsters with MacBooks drinking artisanal coffee, you've got monks with hand-forged tools creating everything from books to beer to life-saving medicines. And somehow, it all worked in perfect harmony. The abbot wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was essentially the CEO of a multinational corporation. He had to manage agricultural estates scattered across hundreds of miles, coordinate with kings and bishops on political matters, oversee international trade deals, manage a workforce of hundreds of monks plus lay workers, and still maintain the spiritual mission that justified the entire operation. These places were running hospitals that were centuries ahead of their time. The monastery of Cluny had a medical facility that could treat over 200 patients simultaneously. They had specialized wards for different conditions, a pharmacy that manufactured medicines from their own herb gardens, and medical libraries that preserved Greek and Roman medical knowledge that had been lost everywhere else in Europe. And the brewing operations? Absolutely legendary. Monasteries like Weihenstephan in Bavaria weren't just making beer for their own consumption. They were operating commercial breweries that supplied entire regions. But what really blows my mind is how they integrated everything. The same water system that powered their grain mills also supplied their breweries, fed their fish ponds, irrigated their gardens, and provided fresh water to their hospitals. The waste from their livestock operations fertilized their fields. The grain they grew fed their workers and supplied their breweries. The beer they brewed preserved their food and provided safe drinking water. It was a closed-loop system that would make modern sustainability experts weep with joy. The monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy was essentially running a medieval university, a pharmaceutical company, a publishing house, a hotel chain, and an agricultural conglomerate all under one roof. They had monks specializing in medicine, law, engineering, agriculture, manuscript illumination, music composition, and international diplomacy. Some monasteries even had their own armies and conducted their own foreign policy. St. Denis Abbey near Paris was so wealthy and influential that French kings would literally mortgage their kingdoms to borrow money from the monks. The abbey's treasury was larger than most national treasuries. They were financing crusades, funding cathedral construction projects across Europe, and making loans to merchants that enabled international trade on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Renaissance. And the guest house operations were absolutely insane. The monastery of Cluny could simultaneously accommodate over 300 guests, providing them with private rooms, meals, entertainment, and even postal services. They had standardized pricing, reservation systems, and customer service, protocols that wouldn't look out of place in a modern hotel chain. Pilgrims traveling across Europe knew they could count on Benedictine hospitality wherever they went, creating brand loyalty that lasted for centuries. The manuscript copying operations were the medieval equivalent of a publishing empire. The monastery of Tours could produce dozens of hand-copied books simultaneously, with specialized teams for different stages of production: parchment preparation, text copying, illumination, binding. They had quality control inspectors who would reject work that didn't meet their standards. They maintained catalogs of their inventory and operated lending libraries that served scholars across Europe. But here's what really gets me: the agricultural innovations. These monasteries were conducting agricultural experiments centuries before the scientific revolution. The Cistercians developed new plowing techniques that increased crop yields by 40%. They were the first to systematically rotate crops to maintain soil fertility. They created new breeds of livestock and developed preservation techniques that allowed them to store food for years. The monastery of Fontenay in France had developed a hydraulic system so sophisticated that it could power 12 different types of machinery simultaneously: grain mills, fulling mills for cloth production, hammers for the forge, saws for the lumber mill, and even mechanical bellows for their blast furnaces. They were mass-producing iron tools and weapons with techniques that wouldn't be improved until the Industrial Revolution. And the networking? These monasteries were connected by communication networks that spanned continents. A message could travel from a monastery in Ireland to one in Poland in less time than it took most people to travel to the next village. They had their own postal systems, their own diplomatic corps, and their own intelligence networks. The abbot of Cluny knew what was happening in Constantinople before most European kings knew what was happening in their own capitals. The financial operations were equally sophisticated. Monasteries were the medieval equivalent of international banks. They could transfer money across thousands of miles using letters of credit. They operated foreign exchange services, provided international loans, and even issued what amounted to medieval credit cards, documents that allowed travelers to access funds at any monastery in their network. But here's the craziest part. They were doing all of this while maintaining a spiritual mission that required them to pray together 8 times a day, fast regularly, take vows of poverty, and dedicate their lives to serving God. Imagine running Amazon while also being required to stop for prayer and meditation every 3 hours. It's absolutely mind-blowing. The archaeological evidence from sites like Rievaulx Abbey in England shows industrial complexes that were processing raw materials on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the 18th century. They had blast furnaces, textile mills, tanneries, and metalworking shops, all powered by sophisticated water management systems. The waste heat from their forges was channeled to warm their living quarters. The clay from their pottery workshops was sourced from their own quarries. Even their garbage was systematically processed and recycled. But wait, what I'm about to tell you next will make everything we've discussed so far seem absolutely ordinary by comparison. Because these weren't just religious communities, they were the most advanced technology companies of their era. They were Google, Apple, Amazon, and Harvard University, all rolled into one, operating with a level of integration and efficiency that modern corporations can only dream of achieving. And managing these medieval empires required people with job titles and responsibilities that would absolutely baffle any modern HR department. The individuals running these operations had roles so specialized, so bizarre, and so crucial that Their job descriptions read like something out of a fantasy novel. But these weren't fictional positions. They were real jobs that real people performed every single day in medieval Europe. The people running these operations had job titles. That would puzzle any modern HR department, from the master of the wine cellar who controlled international trade routes, to the keeper of the royal menagerie who managed exotic animals worth more than entire kingdoms. Medieval job descriptions were about to get very, very strange indeed. But here's where medieval life gets absolutely fascinating. And trust me, I've spent years diving into these ancient records that most people never even think about. The job descriptions alone will blow your mind. Picture this. You're applying for work at a medieval monastery, and the job posting says, "Roundsman wanted, must be comfortable walking the halls for 12 hours straight, checking that nobody's talking, sleeping or, God forbid, having an unauthorized snack." These guys were basically hall monitors for grown men who'd supposedly dedicated their lives to God. The roundsman would patrol the corridors with a lantern, listening at doors, peeking around corners, making sure everyone was following the rule. Of silence. And then there was the chamberlain. Imagine being the guy whose entire career revolved around scheduling bath times for 100 monks who were supposed to bathe exactly 4 times a year. 4 times. The chamberlain had detailed ledgers tracking who bathed when, who was overdue, who was trying to sneak in extra baths. Because apparently even basic hygiene required a bureaucrat in medieval times. The most mind-blowing part. The scriptoriums. Picture massive halls filled with rows of desks, each monk hunched over parchment with a quill, copying manuscripts in complete silence. Not a whisper, not a cough, just the endless scratching of quill against vellum for 6, 7, 8 hours straight. I'm talking about guys who spent their entire adult lives in mandatory silence, communicating only through hand signals and the occasional approved nod. And here's the kicker. They had snitching systems, official ones. There were monks whose job it was to report other monks for infractions, talking during work hours, reported, falling asleep during midnight prayers, reported, looking at another. Monk the wrong way? You guessed it, reported. They had elaborate hierarchies of tattletales, all in the name of spiritual discipline. But if you think that sounds oppressive, wait until you hear what I discovered about the violence. Because here's the absolutely shocking truth that nobody talks about. These supposedly peaceful houses of God were often more dangerous than the streets outside their walls. Imagine if your yoga studio had a higher crime rate than downtown Detroit, or if your meditation retreat had more violent incidents than a sports bar on Super Bowl Sunday. That's essentially what we're dealing with in some medieval monasteries. Let me tell you about Abbot Abbo of Fleury. This guy was running one of the most prestigious monasteries in medieval France. Learned man, respected scholar, supposedly a model of Christian virtue. In the year 1004, he got into a heated argument with some visiting monks about, get this, proper monastery management techniques. The discussion escalated, voices were raised, and before anyone could say, turn the other cheek, someone grabbed a spear and stabbed Abbot Abbo right through the chest, inside the monastery, during what was supposed to be a peaceful theological discussion. The witnesses described blood pooling on the stone floors of the chapter house, while monks stood around, in shock, their white robes splattered red. This wasn't some random street violence. This was a premeditated murder inside one of Europe's most sacred spaces, committed by men who'd taken vows of peace and brotherhood. Picture the scene. Men who spent their days copying scripture about turning the other cheek, suddenly facing a crime scene that would make modern detective shows look tame. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here was ultimate proof that even the most controlled environments can't fully contain human nature's darker impulses. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here was ultimate proof that even the most controlled environments can't fully contain human nature's darker impulses. And Abbo wasn't an isolated case. I found records of monks beating each other with candlesticks during choir practice because apparently someone was singing off-key. There were fistfights in the scriptorium over proper letter formation. Kitchen. Brawls that turned deadly over soup seasoning. These places that were supposed to be havens of tranquility and spiritual reflection were sometimes more violent than medieval taverns. The contrast is absolutely staggering. Imagine walking into a monastery at dawn, the air filled with the sound of Gregorian chant echoing off stone walls, candles flickering in the semi-darkness, the sweet smell of incense mixing with the mustiness of ancient books. Everything seems peaceful, sacred, removed from the chaos of the outside world. The monks move in perfect formation, their sandals whispering against stone floors, their heads bowed in apparent devotion. But then you look closer, and you notice the nervous glances, the way certain monks avoid eye contact with others, the subtle tension in the way they hold their bodies during prayer. Because underneath that veneer of holy calm, there's a powder, keg of human drama just waiting to explode. The abbots knew this, of course. They weren't stupid. They developed increasingly elaborate systems to manage the violence and interpersonal conflicts. Some monasteries instituted mandatory cooling-off periods where feuding monks were separated for weeks at a time. Others used what can only be described as medieval anger management, forced manual labor designed to exhaust potential troublemakers. But the most fascinating solution? Ghost stories, I'm not kidding. Abbots would deliberately cultivate supernatural legends about their monasteries, spreading rumors about vengeful spirits that punished monks who broke the peace. They'd stage mysterious sounds in the middle of the night, arrange for supernatural interventions during conflicts, basically running elaborate psychological operations on their own monks to keep them in line. Picture a monk who's been feuding with his neighbor in the scriptorium, planning his revenge, maybe thinking about putting some extra salt in the guy's soup or hiding his favorite quill. Then he hears whispered stories about Brother Marcus, who started a fight in the kitchen last year and was found the next morning speaking in tongues, claiming that ghostly hands had grabbed him in his sleep. Suddenly that revenge plot doesn't seem so appealing. Imagine if modern offices could solve their drama by spreading strategic ghost stories about what happens to people who steal lunches from the office fridge. The ghost stories worked because these guys genuinely believed in the supernatural. They'd already committed to a worldview where invisible forces shaped reality. It wasn't a huge leap to believe that their particular monastery was haunted by vengeful spirits who enforced divine justice. The abbots were essentially running medieval corporate HR departments, using supernatural fear as their primary management tool. And the really crazy part is how this violence coexisted with genuine moments of transcendent beauty and spiritual achievement. The same hands that copied the most exquisite illuminated manuscripts, creating works of art that still take your breath away centuries later, would sometimes be bruised from fistfights the night before. Monks who could achieve states of mystical prayer that modern people can barely comprehend would also harbor grudges and plot petty revenge against their brothers. It's like finding out that your yoga instructor has been running an underground fight club, or discovering that the peaceful meditation retreat you attended was actually the site of decades of staff drama that would make reality TV producers weep with joy. The cognitive dissonance is absolutely mind-blowing, but here's what really gets me. Despite all this chaos, all this violence, all these petty human dramas playing out in supposedly sacred spaces, these communities somehow managed to preserve and transmit the knowledge that became the foundation of Western civilization. They copied the classical texts, developed new theological insights, created art and music that still moves us today, all while occasionally stabbing each other with kitchen implements over theological disputes. The human element couldn't be suppressed, no matter how many rules they created, no matter how much they tried to transcend their earthly nature. These were men who'd given up family, property, the prospect of romantic love, all in service of a higher calling. But they were still fundamentally human, with all the petty jealousies, territorial disputes, and personal conflicts that entails. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing of all. Not that they sometimes failed to live up to their ideals, but that they managed to create something beautiful and lasting despite their very human flaws. The violence and the sacred coexisted in the same spaces, created by the same people, part of the same incredibly complex human story. It's like discovering that the most beautiful cathedral was built by people who occasionally got into fistfights about architecture, or learning that the most peaceful garden was tended by gardeners who sometimes threw tools at each other over proper planting techniques. The beauty emerged not despite the humanity, but because of it. Despite the chaos and violence, despite the snitching systems and the ghost story management techniques, despite the fact that some of the most peaceful places on Earth were actually hotbeds of interpersonal drama, these troubled communities discovered something remarkable. Because while they were busy fighting over soup seasoning and proper manuscript formatting, while they were developing elaborate bureaucracies to manage bathing schedules and midnight patrols, something else was happening that would completely transform how we think about human well-being. Yet somehow, these troubled communities discovered something remarkable. What these medieval monks discovered wasn't just a way to survive harsh winters or endless labor. They had unlocked something far more profound, something that would take the modern world nearly 1,000 years to rediscover. They had created what we might call today the ultimate wellness revolution. Imagine scrolling through Instagram and seeing a wellness influencer promoting the medieval method, promising better sleep, deeper focus, stronger community bonds, and sustainable productivity. You'd probably roll your eyes and keep scrolling. But here's the kicker. These monks were already living that exact lifestyle centuries before anyone invented the term wellness influencer. Picture this scene with me. It's dawn in a medieval monastery, somewhere around the year 1200. The first bells are ringing across stone corridors, their sound echoing off ancient walls. Brother Thomas rises from his simple wooden bed, not to the jarring buzz of a smartphone alarm, but to the gentle rhythm that has guided his community for centuries. He washes his face in cold water from a stone basin, the shock awakening his senses in a way no coffee could match. His breathing is steady, measured, intentional. His mind isn't racing through a mental checklist of emails, notifications, and daily anxieties. Instead, he's present, fully present in this single moment of awakening. This is what mindfulness looks like when it's not an app on your phone, but simply the natural rhythm of a life designed around human flourishing. While we're paying premium prices for meditation retreats to experience 5 minutes of this kind of presence, Brother Thomas was living it as his default state. This is where the story gets absolutely mind-blowing. Everything that's trending in wellness culture right now, everything that Silicon Valley executives are paying thousands of dollars to learn, everything that wellness influencers are packaging as revolutionary new discoveries was already being practiced to perfection in medieval monasteries over 1,000 years ago. Let me break this down for you, because when you see these connections, you'll never look at modern wellness trends the same way again. Take digital detox, for instance. In 2024, Forbes published an entire feature on the growing trend of monk mode, where successful entrepreneurs disconnect from all digital devices to focus on deep work and mental clarity. Tech executives are booking expensive retreats in remote locations, paying premium prices to experience what they call digital silence. They're discovering, as if for the first time, that constant connectivity is destroying their ability to think deeply, to create meaningfully, to simply be present in their own lives. It's like watching someone pay thousands of dollars to experience what medieval monks got for free every single day. While we're desperately trying to escape the digital noise that we created, they were living in the ultimate analog environment, where the only notifications were church bells and the only apps they needed were prayer books and garden tools. But here's the kicker. Medieval monks had achieved the ultimate digital detox by default. No notifications, no social media, no constant ping of messages demanding immediate attention. Their minds weren't fragmented by the endless scroll of information. Instead, they experienced what neuroscientists today call deep focus states, where the brain can engage in complex creative thinking for extended periods without interruption. While we're desperately downloading apps to block other apps, installing software to prevent ourselves from using software, these monks were living in airplane mode, where the only wireless connection they needed was their connection to each other and to their deeper purpose. Brother Thomas, walking through those monastery gardens in the early morning light, his footsteps crunching softly on frost-covered paths, was experiencing what modern wellness experts now charge hundreds of dollars to teach mindful walking meditation. But for him, it wasn't a technique learned from an app or a weekend workshop. It was simply Tuesday. The meditation practices that are now filling studios across major cities, commanding premium memberships and celebrity endorsements, were the daily bread of monastic life. These weren't 30-minute sessions squeezed between meetings. These were integrated, throughout the day practices of contemplative awareness. The monks weren't trying to find inner peace. They were living it, breathing it, embodying it in every aspect of their structured existence. These weren't 30-minute sessions squeezed between meetings. These were integrated, throughout the day practices of contemplative awareness. The monks weren't trying to find inner peace. They were living it, breathing it, embodying it in every aspect of their structured existence. And speaking of structure, let's talk about what Business Insider recently called the optimization revolution. Modern productivity gurus are teaching time blocking, ritual creation, and what they term lifestyle design. They're discovering that human beings thrive on routine, on purposeful structure, on knowing that every part of their day serves a greater purpose. Medieval monasteries were the original lifestyle design laboratories. Every hour had meaning. Every activity served the greater good of the community and the individual's spiritual development. Morning prayers, manual labor, study time, communal meals, evening reflection. There was no wasted time, no mindless scrolling, no existential confusion about what to do next. The structure itself became a form of freedom, liberating the mind from decision fatigue and allowing deeper engagement with life's essential activities. The minimalism movement that's captured the attention of millions, promising freedom through owning less, was the foundation of monastic existence. Marie Kondo's life-changing magic of tidying up. Medieval monks had mastered this centuries before she was born. They understood that physical simplicity creates mental clarity, that fewer possessions mean fewer distractions from what truly matters. Brother Thomas owned perhaps 3 sets of robes, a few books, basic toiletries, and little else. But this wasn't poverty as we might imagine it. This was intentional abundance, the abundance that comes from knowing exactly what you need and finding deep satisfaction in having precisely that. Nothing more, nothing less. His cell was clean, organized, beautiful in its simplicity. Every object had a purpose, a place, a reason for being there. It's like he had Marie Kondo as his life coach, except instead of asking, "Does this spark joy?" he was asking, "Does this serve my deepest purpose?" While we're drowning in stuff we don't need and can't find what we're looking for, Brother Thomas could put his hands on everything he owned in about 30 seconds. Modern wellness culture is rediscovering what the monks knew intuitively, that external simplicity creates internal spaciousness. When your environment isn't cluttered, your mind isn't cluttered. When you're not constantly making decisions about stuff, you have more mental energy for the things that actually matter. The community living aspect that's now trending in co-housing, movements, intentional communities, and what researchers call social wellness, was perfected in medieval monasteries. These weren't just random groups of people living together. These were carefully structured communities where individual growth and collective thriving were balanced with extraordinary sophistication. Fast Company recently ran a series on the importance of authentic community in combating modern loneliness and mental health challenges. They highlighted how isolation is literally killing people, how the breakdown of genuine social connection is creating epidemics of depression, anxiety, and what they term deaths of despair. The solution they propose: intentional community building, shared purpose, collective rituals that create belonging. Medieval monasteries had solved this problem completely. Brother Thomas didn't just live alongside others, he was woven into a tapestry of mutual support, shared responsibility, and collective purpose that modern community builders are struggling to recreate. When he woke each morning, he knew his role, his value to the community, his place in something larger than himself. The work-life balance that modern culture is desperately trying to achieve was inherent in monastic structure. There was no separation between meaningful work and spiritual development, between personal growth and community contribution. Manual labor wasn't separate from prayer, study wasn't disconnected from service. Every activity was integrated into a holistic understanding of human flourishing. When Brother Thomas tended the monastery gardens, his hands deep in rich soil, watching seeds transform into sustenance for his community, he wasn't just farming. He was engaging in what we now call grounding practices, connecting with the earth in ways that modern research shows reduces cortisol levels, improves mood, and enhances overall well-being. But he didn't need research to tell him this. He could feel it in his bones, in the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful, purposeful work. The seasonal living that wellness influencers are now promoting, encouraging people to align their activities with natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules, was the foundation of monastic existence. These communities didn't fight against winter or try to maintain summer energy levels year-round. They understood that human beings are part of natural cycles, that honoring these rhythms rather than resisting them creates deeper health and contentment. The contemplative practices that are now being studied in neuroscience labs, showing measurable improvements in brain function, emotional regulation, and overall life satisfaction, were the daily practice of medieval monks. They didn't need scientific validation to know that regular periods of silence, reflection, and inner attention created profound transformation. They could see it in their own lives, in the lives of their brothers, in the quality of their community. What's particularly remarkable is how these practices created resilience. Medieval life was harsh by our standards. Winters were brutal, food was often scarce, medical care was primitive, and death was a constant companion. Yet monastery records show remarkable levels of contentment, purpose, and what we might today call psychological well-being among these communities. They had developed what positive psychology now terms post-traumatic growth, the ability to not just survive difficulty, but to use it as a catalyst for deeper wisdom, stronger character, and more meaningful existence. The very challenges that might break individuals in isolation became opportunities for community bonding, spiritual development, and practical problem-solving when faced within the supportive structure of monastic life. The mindful eating practices that are now taught in expensive workshops, promising better digestion, weight management, and relationship with food, were standard in monastery refectories. Meals were eaten in silence or with reading, allowing full attention to the experience of nourishment. Food was prepared with care, consumed with gratitude, and never wasted. There was no mindless snacking, no emotional eating, no disconnection from the source and purpose of sustenance. Brother Thomas, sitting with his community for the midday meal, wasn't scrolling through his phone or rushing through lunch to get back to work. He was fully present to the flavors, textures, and nourishment before him. He was grateful not just in theory, but in the lived experience of appreciation for the hands that prepared the food, the earth that produced it, and the community that made this sharing possible. The sleep optimization that's now a multi-billion-dollar industry with apps, devices, and supplements all promising better rest was naturally achieved in monastic settings. Regular sleep schedules, darkened environments, evening routines that promoted relaxation, and the absence of stimulating inputs before bedtime created what sleep researchers now identify as optimal conditions for restorative rest. But this structured paradise came with its own set of challenges. The very systems that created such remarkable wellness outcomes also generated intense pressure on individuals who struggled to thrive within them. Behind the successful wellness system were individual monks facing very human challenges that would test the limits of even the most supportive community. Behind the successful wellness system were individual monks facing very human challenges. Yet even in this seemingly perfect world of structured prayer and purposeful work, something darker lurked beneath the surface. Picture this. Brother Thomas waking on his straw mattress, the animal skin blanket scratchy against his face, his breath visible in the cold morning air of his stone cell. The bells are calling him to lauds, but his limbs feel like lead and a crushing weight sits on his chest that has nothing to do with the cold. This was acedia, what medieval monks called the foul darkness that could descend without warning. If you think workplace burnout is a modern invention, think again. These men knew it intimately, describing it as feeling as if the sun was too slow in setting, watching the hours drag by in an endless parade of sameness. I've spent years studying these medieval accounts, and the parallels to our modern understanding of depression are absolutely mind-blowing. Brother Evagrius, writing in the 4th century, described acedia as the most oppressive of all the demons. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. To these men, the crushing apathy that made prayer feel meaningless and work feel pointless was as real and dangerous as any Viking raid. Picture Brother William during the long afternoon hours, standing in the scriptorium, but unable to focus on the manuscript before him. The other monks are bent over their work, quills scratching steadily across parchment, but William's mind keeps wandering. He finds himself staring out the narrow window, counting stones in the wall, anything to distract from the gnawing restlessness that makes his skin feel too tight. The monastery records are filled with these struggles. Brother Marcus has been afflicted with the noonday demon, one abbot wrote, using another term for acedia. He wanders the corridors like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. This wasn't seen as a moral failing. It was recognized as a genuine illness that required treatment and understanding. What's remarkable is how these communities developed support systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern therapeutic setting. When a brother showed signs of acedia, he wasn't shunned or punished. Instead, the abbot might assign him to work alongside the most cheerful members of the community. What's remarkable is how these communities developed support systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern therapeutic setting. When a brother showed signs of acedia, he wasn't shunned or punished. Instead, the abbot might assign him to work alongside the most cheerful members of the community. Garden duty was particularly favored. There's something about working with growing things that seems to lift the spirit. Brother Jerome kept detailed notes about his own battles with what he called the grey sickness. Today, the darkness lifted. Enough that I could taste my bread at breakfast, he wrote. Brother Peter sat with me in silence, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. These weren't just religious men. They were human beings dealing with the same psychological struggles we face today, just wrapped in different language. The isolation could be crushing. Imagine spending your entire adult life within the same stone walls, seeing the same faces day after day, following the same routine with clockwork precision. Some monks thrived in this environment, but others found it suffocating. The records speak of brothers who would walk the monastery walls at night, desperate for any change in scenery, any break from the endless sameness. And then there were the more earthly temptations that tested their resolve. Despite their vows of celibacy and spiritual focus, these were still flesh and blood men with all the desires and frustrations that entails. The monastery rules are very specific about avoiding particular friendships, relationships that became too intense or exclusive. Reading between the lines, it's clear that romantic attachments, both appropriate and inappropriate, were a constant challenge. Brother Augustine's private journals, discovered centuries later, reveal the agony of falling in love with a young novice. I pray for strength to see him only as a brother in Christ, he wrote, but my heart betrays me at every turn. Is this love a gift from God or a test of my devotion? His struggle continued for years, a testament to the very human conflicts that existed within these supposedly pure spiritual communities. The politics could be just as brutal as any royal court. Monks were human, after all, and where humans gather, there's gossip, jealousy, and power struggles. The kitchen assignment rotations became battlegrounds. Who got to work in the warmer areas near the ovens? Who was stuck with the endless task of copying tedious legal documents versus the prestigious illuminated manuscripts? Brother Francis wrote bitterly about the favoritism he observed. The abbot's nephew somehow always draws the easiest duties, while those of us with no connections scrub floors until our knees bleed. Sound familiar? The monastery might have been devoted to spiritual matters, but it operated with all too human dynamics. Yet what's truly extraordinary is how these communities found ways to support each other through these struggles. When Brother Thomas was deep in his battle with acedia, the others didn't abandon him. They created what we might today call a buddy system. Brother Peter was assigned to check on him regularly, not to preach or counsel, but simply to be present. Sometimes Brother Thomas would just sit in the garden, staring at nothing, Peter wrote. I would sit beside him, and we would watch the bees work the herbs. No words were needed. The weight of solitude shared is lighter than the weight of solitude borne alone. The monks developed what they called remedies for the soul, activities, designed to combat the spiritual depression that could overwhelm them. Music was powerful medicine. When a brother was struggling, the others might gather for extra sessions of chant, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to lift the spirit physically from the body. Physical activity was prescribed like medication. A monk, deep in acedia, might be assigned to help with the heavy work of moving stones for a new wall or harvesting grain. The rhythm of physical labor, the satisfaction of tangible accomplishment, could break through the fog of spiritual numbness in ways that prayer alone sometimes couldn't. And they weren't above simple human pleasures as antidotes to despair. Despite their austere reputation, many monasteries had gardens devoted purely to beauty, flowers that served no practical purpose except to delight the eye. They played chess and various board games during recreation periods. They told stories, shared jokes, and found ways to maintain their humanity within the structure of their spiritual discipline. The chess games could become legendary. Brother Matthew was known throughout the monastery for his brilliant strategic mind, and monks would line up for the privilege of playing against him. These games became social events, with spectators offering commentary and gentle teasing. Brother Matthew contemplates his next move as if the fate of Christianity depends upon it, one chronicle noted with obvious affection. Walking the monastery. Gardens became a form of therapy. These weren't just practical spaces for growing food and herbs. They were designed for contemplation and peace. Winding paths led through carefully tended beds of flowers and vegetables, with benches positioned to catch the morning sun or evening shade. A monk, struggling with depression, might spend hours here, finding in the cycle of growth and renewal, a metaphor for his own spiritual journey. The community meals served a purpose beyond mere nutrition. Yes, they ate in silence while one brother read aloud from scripture or philosophical works, but the very act of sharing food, of being physically present together, created bonds that sustained them through individual struggles. The kitchen brothers took pride in making even the simplest meals as delicious as possible, understanding that food prepared with love could nourish the soul as well as the body. When Brother Paul went through what his journal describes as the darkest winter of my soul, the community rallied around him in ways both profound and beautifully mundane. They assigned him to work with Brother Thomas in the beehives, work that required gentle movements and patience, qualities that seemed to calm his agitated spirit. They made sure he was never alone during the hardest hours of the night, arranging the watch schedules so that someone was always awake and available if he needed to talk. "Knowledge is light," he wrote gratefully, "and in this season of darkness, every candle flame matters." The monastery's approach to what we might now call mental health was remarkably sophisticated. They understood that spiritual crisis often manifested in physical symptoms. The brother who couldn't sleep, the one who lost his appetite, the one whose hands shook during Mass. They treated the whole person, not just the soul. Brother Anselm served as what we might today call a counselor, though his official title was simply spiritual father. Monks could come to him with their struggles, their doubts, their fears, and find not judgment but understanding. His notes reveal a man with remarkable insight into human psychology, centuries before such formal study existed. His notes reveal a man with remarkable insight into human psychology, centuries before such formal study existed. The brother who claims he has no struggles is the one who most needs watching, Anselm wrote. Pride disguised as piety is more dangerous than honest despair, for the despairing soul at least knows it needs healing. Through all these struggles, something extraordinary emerged. The communities that faced their human limitations honestly, that created systems of support rather than systems of denial, discovered something that would prove more valuable than all their agricultural innovations or financial success. They discovered that resilience isn't built through perfection, but through persistence in the face of imperfection. The true measure of their achievement wasn't in their perfection, but in their persistence. And perhaps the most remarkable discovery came just this past year, in 2024, when archaeologists working at Lindisfarne uncovered something that completely changed our understanding of what happened after those Viking raids. I'm talking about a cache of illuminated manuscripts hidden beneath what was once the monastery's scriptorium that tells a story of incredible resilience. Picture this scene. It's the year 794, just 1 year after that first devastating Viking attack. The smoke has cleared, the raiders have sailed away with their plunder, and what's left? Most historians assumed the monastery was abandoned, that the monks fled south to safety. But these newly discovered manuscripts tell a different story entirely. Imagine if, after a devastating hurricane destroyed your neighborhood, instead of evacuating, a few residents stayed behind and started building the most beautiful houses the area had ever seen. That's essentially what these monks did. They turned their trauma into their masterpiece. The parchments show that a small group of monks stayed behind. Not only did they stay, but they continued their work. Here's the truly mind-blowing part. Some of the most beautiful illuminated letters ever found in Britain were created in the months immediately following the Viking raids. These weren't desperate scribbles by traumatized survivors. These were masterpieces of medieval art, created with the same precision and devotion as anything produced during the monastery's golden age. The forensic analysis of the ink reveals something even more astonishing. The monks were using expensive imported pigments, ultramarine blue from Afghanistan, gold leaf that would have cost a fortune. This wasn't about mere survival. This was about maintaining their identity, their purpose, their connection to something larger than themselves, even in the face of absolute devastation. Think about what that means. While most people would be focused on basic survival, finding food, staying warm, staying safe, these monks were importing luxury art supplies from across the known world. It's like survivors of a natural disaster deciding to throw a world-class art exhibition in the ruins of their former home. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who led the archaeological team, told me something that gave me chills. She said, "When we first opened, that manuscript cache, the scent of incense, was still detectable after 1,200 years. These weren't just books, they were prayers made tangible, hope preserved in ink and gold." Think about what that means. Here were people who had witnessed unimaginable horror, who had lost friends, who had seen their life's work literally go up in flames, and their response wasn't to flee or to despair. Their response was to create something beautiful. Their response was to continue their daily routine of prayer and work and community, even when that community had been reduced to maybe a dozen souls living in the ruins of their former home. This discovery reveals something profound about the human capacity for resilience. These monks understood something that we're only rediscovering in our modern psychological research. That structure and ritual and purposeful work aren't just nice-to-haves when times are good. They become absolutely essential when times are bad. The manuscript cache included what appears to be a daily schedule, written in Middle English and Latin, that governed the lives of these survivors. It's remarkably similar to the rule of Saint Benedict that guided monastery life, but adapted for their new reality. They still woke for lauds at dawn, still gathered for meals, still maintained their cycles of work and prayer and rest, but they had learned to be flexible, to adapt their ancient practices to radically change circumstances. And here's where this medieval story becomes urgently relevant to our modern lives. Because if we're honest, haven't we all been living through our own kind of Viking raids these past few years? Maybe not literal warriors with axes, but disruptions that felt just as devastating to our carefully constructed routines and identities. The global pandemic turned our world upside down. Economic uncertainty has left many of us feeling like those monks, surveying the wreckage of plans we thought were solid. Social media and digital overwhelm create a different kind of constant, low-level threat. Not raiders coming over the horizon, but notifications and news cycles and comparison culture that can be just as destructive to our peace of mind. But those Lindisfarne monks discovered something that modern neuroscience is now proving, that our brains are remarkably adaptable, but they need structure to function optimally, especially during times of stress. They need the equivalent of those medieval hours of prayer and work and rest. Recent studies in chronobiology, the science of our internal clocks, show that people who maintain consistent daily rhythms, even simple ones, show greater resilience to stress, better emotional regulation, and improved cognitive function. It's as if those monks intuited something that we're only now understanding through brain imaging and hormone analysis. While we're using expensive wearable devices and sleep-tracking apps to optimize our circadian rhythms, these medieval monks had already perfected the art of living in harmony with their natural biological clocks. They were basically human performance experts, except their lab was a stone monastery, and their data was measured in decades of sustainable well-being. The manuscripts from Lindisfarne include detailed notes about seasonal living that would make any modern wellness guru jealous. They tracked how their energy levels changed with the seasons, adjusted their work schedules accordingly, and built in specific rituals for the darkest months of winter. They understood that human beings aren't machines that should operate at the same level year-round. During the long winter months following the Viking attack, these monks developed what they called ember days, periods of deeper contemplation and reduced external activity. They weren't being lazy or giving in to depression. They were working with their natural rhythms, honoring the fact that human energy naturally ebbs and flows like the tide. Compare that to our modern approach, where we expect ourselves to maintain the same level of productivity and social engagement 12 months a year. We've forgotten the wisdom of seasonality, the importance of fallow periods, the necessity of rest as an active practice rather than a guilty indulgence. The Lindisfarne manuscripts describe something they called boundary keeping, intentional practices for protecting their mental and spiritual space from external chaos. They would begin each day by spending time in what they called the Great Silence, a period of complete quiet before the demands of the day began. They ended each day with what they called the examination, not a harsh self-criticism, but a gentle review of where they had found meaning and connection. Sound familiar? These are essentially the practices that modern mindfulness teaches, beginning the day with meditation, ending it with reflection. But the monks had an advantage we often lack. They understood that these weren't optional extras, for when life was going well, they were non-negotiables, especially when life was falling apart. The manuscripts also reveal how they dealt with what we might now call trauma responses. They had specific rituals for what they called days of heaviness, times when grief or fear or overwhelm made normal functioning difficult. Instead of pushing through or trying to think their way out of it, they had communal practices, special meals, group prayers, time spent in the monastery gardens that honored the difficulty while providing gentle structure and support. One of the most beautiful discoveries in the manuscript cache was a collection of what the archaeologists are calling hope letters, notes that the surviving monks wrote to their future selves and to the monks who might one day return to Lindisfarne. These weren't just messages, they were time capsules of wisdom, practical advice for maintaining faith and purpose in the darkest of times. One letter, written in elegant script, says, "Remember that the light returns, even when the darkness feels endless. Remember that small acts of beauty and devotion matter more in hard times than in easy ones. Remember that community can be as small as two people who choose to care for each other's well-being." Another note, apparently written during a particularly difficult winter, says, "Do not despise the simple rituals, the warming of bread, the lighting of candles, the speaking of old prayers. These are not trivial things. They are the threads that weave meaning back into a world that seems to have lost its pattern." These medieval monks understood something that we're desperately trying to relearn, that resilience isn't about being tough enough to handle anything. Resilience is about having practices and communities and ways of making meaning that can bend without breaking, that can adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their essential core. The archaeological evidence shows that this small community of survivors maintained their life at Lindisfarne for almost 15 years after the Viking raids, until political changes made it safer to relocate to Durham. They didn't just survive. They created some of the most beautiful art and writing of their entire era. They proved that creativity and hope aren't luxuries that we can only afford when life is easy. They're necessities that become even more important when life is hard. Which brings us full circle to where we started this incredible journey together. Remember, when we first stepped into those stone corridors at 4:30 a.m., watching those sleep-deprived saints who had somehow cracked the code on sustainable high performance. We began by exploring the weird and wonderful aspects of medieval monastic life, all those strange customs and brutal realities that seem so foreign to our modern experience. But what we've discovered is that the strangeness was mostly on the surface. Underneath those alien practices and harsh circumstances, we found something remarkably familiar. Human beings trying to create meaning and beauty and connection in the face of uncertainty and hardship. We found people who understood that individual well-being is inseparable from community well-being, that our daily choices about how we structure our time and attention have profound consequences for our mental and spiritual health. And here's what absolutely blows my mind. Everything we promised to explore at the beginning, how these medieval monks mastered productivity centuries before Silicon Valley existed, how they created wellness systems that modern influencers are desperately trying to recreate, how they built resilient communities that lasted for centuries. We've not only delivered on those promises, but discovered they go even deeper than we imagined. The monks of medieval Europe weren't perfect. They struggled with depression, workplace drama, violence, favoritism, and all the messy complications that come with being human. But they created something extraordinary from those struggles, communities that lasted for centuries, practices that sustained people through the hardest times, and wisdom that we're still learning from today. Maybe that's the most important lesson they offer us, that we don't have to wait until we're perfect to start building meaningful lives. We don't have to solve all our problems before we can create beauty or contribute to something larger than ourselves. We can start where we are with what we have, surrounded by other imperfect people who are also trying to figure it out. The monastery bells that called those medieval monks to prayer each morning weren't ringing for saints. They were ringing for ordinary people who had committed to showing up day after day, even when they didn't feel like it, especially when they didn't feel like it. So as we come to the end of our journey through this weird and wonderful world, I want to leave you with a few practical takeaways from these medieval masters of human flourishing. These aren't abstract historical curiosities, they're practices you can implement starting tomorrow morning. First, consider seasonal scheduling. Just as those monks adjusted their daily rhythms to match the natural light cycles, you can experiment with honoring your own seasonal energy patterns. Maybe that means going to bed earlier in winter and giving yourself permission to do less when your energy naturally wanes. Maybe it means recognizing that your creativity peaks at different times of year and planning accordingly. Second, create your own version of boundary keeping. Start and end each day with a few minutes of what the Lindisfarne monks called the Great Silence. Time for your mind to settle before the demands of the day begin. Time to process and release before sleep. These don't have to be elaborate. Meditation sessions. Even 3 minutes of quiet breathing can create a buffer between you and the chaos of modern life. Third, prioritize simple daily rituals that create meaning. The monks understood that small repeated acts of beauty and devotion, lighting candles, preparing food with care, walking slowly through natural spaces, have cumulative power to transform both our inner state and our outer circumstances. What simple ritual could you add to your day that would connect you to something larger than your immediate concerns? Fourth, invest in community, even if it starts small. The monks' greatest strength wasn't their individual discipline. It was their commitment to showing up for each other, especially during difficult times. Modern life makes this challenging, but the principle remains. Find ways to be genuinely present with others, to offer support without trying to fix everything, to create spaces where people can be honestly human without judgment. Finally, remember that resilience comes through persistence, not perfection. Those Lindisfarne monks who stayed behind after the Viking raids weren't heroes because they never struggled. They were heroes because they kept creating beauty and meaning, even when their world had fallen apart. They showed up for their daily practices, even when those practices felt empty. They continued to care for each other, even when they were struggling themselves. In a world that often feels as chaotic and threatening as any medieval winter, that feels as unpredictable as any Viking raid, we can learn from people who faced similar challenges with remarkable grace, not because they were superhuman, but because they were deeply, persistently human in all the best ways. The incense that still clings to those 1,000-year-old manuscripts isn't just a curiosity for archaeologists. It's a reminder that the small things we do with intention and care can outlast empires, can carry forward the best of human wisdom across centuries, can provide comfort and guidance to people we'll never meet in times we can't imagine. What you choose to create, how you choose to show up, the kind of presence you bring to your daily life. These things matter more than you know. They're your contribution to the long conversation of human flourishing, your addition to the collective, wisdom that will guide future generations through their own challenges. The medieval monks understood something that we are still learning, that the ordinary moments of life, approached with intention and care, are actually the most sacred moments, that the daily choice to create rather than destroy, to connect rather than isolate, to persist rather than give up, is what transforms both individuals and communities. So whether you're dealing with your own version of acedia, trying to create meaning in a chaotic world, or simply looking for ways to live with more purpose and less anxiety, remember the monks. Remember that they were just people, like you, trying to figure out how to live well. And remember that they succeeded not in spite of their humanity, but because of it. The bells are still ringing, calling us to our own version of the meaningful life. The question is, are we ready to answer? Thank you for taking this incredible journey with me through the weird and wonderful world of medieval monasteries. If this exploration of history's hidden wisdom resonated with you, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What medieval practice might you try incorporating into your modern life? What lesson from these ancient communities speaks most directly to your current challenges? I read every comment and often discover insights I hadn't considered. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, consider subscribing for more adventures in historical wisdom. Because here's what I've discovered after years of exploring these forgotten stories. The more we learn about how people lived in other times and places, the more we uncover the timeless patterns of human flourishing. The more we understand about our ancestors' solutions to universal problems, the better equipped we are to create meaningful, resilient lives of our own. Your journey into applying these ancient insights starts now. Which one will you try first? Until our next journey together, may you find your own version of the Great Silence, your own meaningful daily rituals, your own community of imperfect people committed to showing up for each other. May you remember that ordinary moments approached with intention are actually sacred moments, and may you have the wisdom to know that your daily choices about how to live, how to care, how to persist are writing the next chapter in humanity's long story of hope. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, and remember, the light always returns even when the darkness feels endless.